And it's a very challenging thing, slavery, because on the one hand, you know, the I would say culturally, the Jewish people are the very symbol of let my people go, right? I would say that there's a very significant portion of the civil rights movement, of the abolitionist movement, which leverages off the story of Moshe and let my people go, and when Moses went to Egypt land, right, and that whole "Let my people go" sort of song, right? So we definitely get headlines for "Let my people go," and then you might be sort of shocked if you're listening to a lecture of, as it would happen, a Jew, although a very atheist Jew, Yuval Noah Harari, and he says, the Bible endorses slavery in no less than the Ten Commandments, right? And you're like, well, wait a minute. Is that true? Does the Bible endorse slavery in the Ten Commandments? And we will see that actually does manifest. It's not super clear. The Ten Commandments is going to go a little bit both ways on slavery, and the the Torah seems to accommodate structures of slavery, even at the same time as it seems to abhor it in other ways. And so it's very difficult to sort of kind of get a grasp of how to understand that. So, let me just, okay. So let's take a quick look at what this is meant to mean here. All right, so slavery in the Bible is where we are. Now, there are two types of Eved Ivri. And with that, I'm going to just briefly take us to two sections of the Torah. One not in this week's Parsha, and another in this week's Parsha itself. Okay. So this is Parshat Mishpatim. Parshat Mishpatim starts Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim livnehem. These are the statutes, the rules that I'm putting before you. Ki tikne eved ivri sheish shanim yavod vashvi yetzei lechavshi chinam. When you acquire a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free. And it has all sorts of laws about this slave, but then it tells us that if the slave declares, "I love my master and my wife and my children, I do not wish to go free." And what are you supposed to do? It says, "V'yisho Adonav el Elohim v'yisho al adelet," and his master shall take him before God, and take him before the door or the doorpost, and the master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and then he remain his master's slave for life. It's a very strange idea that the slave is going to say, "Okay, you know what? I don't want to be a free man anymore. I like it here with my master. I want you to make me a permanent fixture of servitude." Very hard for us to imagine, but they have to go to the doorpost. This doorpost mezuzah is very, very reminiscent of two things. One is the scroll that we put on the doorpost, and the other is the blood that we put on the doorpost, right? And that either one testifies to the unity of God, and that we're all servants of the same master, the divine master, and the other one speaks to the fact that we all sort of declared freedom from Egypt in this one event. And so here, it's a very there's a lot of dissonance between this slave who says, I'm rejecting that freedom, and he's told to reject it at the very place where the people embraced freedom very broadly. Okay, so that's text number one. Text number two is over here, I believe. Okay. Okay. Okay, here we go. If one of your brothers, now here brothers is used in the broad sense. it means part of the broad people of the Jewish people. If one of your kin under you continue in straits and must be given over you, do not subject them to the treatment of a slave. Here, the word, he's never called a slave, but it's very clear that there's some kind of indenture happening, right? He shall be a hired laborer, and they shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. Now, this could be 15 years, this kind of servitude. It is understood to be something very, very different. So let's go back to our slides here. Okay, so here's what we have: two different things. We have the free person can become a Hebrew slave in one of two ways. One way is that which was described in the first text in Parsha Mishpatim. That's considered a thief. So a thief who has stolen, consumed absolutely everything, has absolutely nothing left to repay the injured party, then the court can sell him into a certain kind of slavery to pay back the debt of his theft. That is the one that takes place in Parshat Mishpatim. That is the one where if he can the punishment can only last up to 7 years. And if he says, no, you know what, this is really good for me, I want to stay in here, that's when you take his ear to the doorpost. There's another idea here, which is not really formally a slavery, but it is a way of dealing with poverty. It is, if a person is impoverished, there was sort of indentured servitude, might be a better way to look at it. It does not actually call him an Eved. Oops. My screen just went blank. I don't know if everybody's seeing the slideshow. Okay, now it came back. Sorry about that. Not sure why that happened. Maybe I got a little too passionate about what was going on. So we have two different versions of things here. Either way, you're dealing with some kind of a slavery. Just to show you that some of the differences here are enshrined in the halacha. This is from the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that hamocher atzmo eino nirtza. So somebody who sells himself into slavery, somebody who makes the decision, I'm too poor, I need to go into this kind of indentured scenario. We do not apply the law of the doorpost. You don't pierce his ear at the doorpost. But if he was sold because of a theft, yes, his ears do get pierced. Mocher atzmo ein ma'anikim lo. There's another halacha that we get later on in the book of Devarim, that if he was sold into slavery, then he gets a severance package once he becomes free. But if he was if he's self-indentured, if he sold himself into slavery, he does not get that kind of severance package. And then there's another interesting thing, is that if you were sold into slavery through the court because of a theft, so one of the things that is afforded you is you have the ability, your master can give you a wife, a shifcha Knaanit, a non-Jewish wife. Rather startling, this whole idea. But if you self-indenture, you are not entitled to that. So this is just, Rambam also codifies all of these things, and he tells us, to what does this term imply? Oops, I wanted to go back here a second. To what does this term imply? A person who sells himself, when a Jew becomes sorely impoverished, the Torah gives him permission to sell himself as a servant, right? When your brother will become impoverished. So it's a welfare system. It allows people to sell themselves into welfare. I sort of discovered that this happened up until relatively modern times. There's a book that was published a couple of years ago called White Trash. And it was sort of an exploration of how this term, which is a very uniquely American term, I should say, U.S. term, how did that come about? And you had colonies like, I think, if I'm not mistaken, North Carolina had provisions in its charter that would allow people to bring over indentured servants, and those indentured servants had children who themselves were indentured. Now, in the Torah system, just because you indenture yourself does not make your children indentured. That's very clear. But this idea that there was a system by which people who were extremely poor could find a way out of poverty through the indenture system is something which existed in the Torah system, and it existed throughout the next 2,000 years, or no, more than that, 3,000 years, even in the broader economy. But there is one other thing that the Rambam says, which is quite interesting. The end of this, the Rambam says, a person is not allowed to sell himself as a servant and stash away the money, use it to buy merchandise or utensils, or give it to his creditor. He may sell himself only when he needs the money for his very livelihood. A person is not permitted to sell himself unless he has no property remaining at all, i.e., his clothing no longer remains. Only in such a situation may he sell himself, right? Right? It says, I mean, in the Hebrew, it's super clear. It's like, Shelo yisha'er lo klum afilu ksut. Right? And this is hard for us to believe, but in the ancient world, there were people who were so poor they did not have a shirt to put on. Right? So only in that situation, you got to be pretty darn poor to be that poor. And so only in that situation, only when you reach absolute dire poverty do we allow you to do that kind of a thing. So it's a very, very narrow definition, and so obviously there are not a lot of people who can get to this, and certainly society doesn't want to create a lot of people who are in such a situation. Okay. Now the Rambam later on he says, "Ma ben mocher atzmo." What is the difference between? We'll do the English. A servant himself sells himself may be sold to a Gentile, while a servant sold to the court may only be sold to a Jew. As it says, when your brother is sold to you, i.e., the court sells him only to you. So if you are sold as part of a theft repayment, so if we just go back a few slides, in this scenario, you cannot be sold to a non-Jew. But this scenario, the second scenario, this one, the impoverished, he can go to the full market. And so that person's indentured contract could be sold to anyone. So just sort of gives us a little bit more of the parameters of what's going on in these scenarios. But must say that in both scenarios, we're talking about to become a Hebrew slave is not simple, because you either have to be super, super poor, or you have to be in a scenario where you stole and could not repay. Both of those, I would imagine, are reasonably limited scenarios. They should not be mass phenomena. Now, just looking a little bit more broadly, trying to widen the lens a little bit to understand this phenomenon, and I promise that before we get to the end of this class, I will try and give you some kind of summary that sort of speaks to what this is all about. So there are two appearances of slavery in the Ten Commandments, and the verses I've taken are from two different presentations of the Ten Commandments. The first one is from the presentation in the book of Shemot in Parshat Yitro. It says, "V'yom hashvi'i Shabbat laHashem Elokecha," on the seventh day shall be Shabbat to Hashem. Right? And then it says, "Lo ta'aseh kol melacha," do not do any manner of work. "Ata uvincha uvitecha, abdecha va'amatecha." Two other people cannot do work. Not your son, your daughter, and not your servant, and not your maidservant. So that means that you cannot have a servant in your home who can do work. So, I don't know, let's just say you know, you're 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 building a new fence, and you really want to get this done and you're behind schedule. You can't turn to your non-Jewish help, the people in your house, and even if they're not Jewish, even if they're Avid Kanani, and say to them, go build me a fence on Shabbos. Can't happen. Why? Because the law is that they are entitled to a day of rest just like you. That this is Hashem's day, and they recognize God as master as well. And so there is, yes, it's true. On the one hand, this is slavery mentioned in the Ten Commandments, but in a way it's mentioned differently than you would expect it to be, because here this is offering a protection for slaves. The second reference is a little bit less, it doesn't tell us anything about how slaves are treated, aside from the fact, that they were treated as chattel or as property. Because it says, Lo tit'aveh beit re'echa, do not be jealous, do not be desirous of the home of your friend, sadehu, his field, va'avdo, va'amato, his male servant and his maid servant, shoro v'chamaro, his ox, his donkey, v'chol asher l're'echa. So clearly here, slaves are put into the list of capital items, or even, non-real estate, but you do get this presentation that yes, slaves are there in the Ten Commandments.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how do we sort of justify the fact that we have nannies in our house or we have caterers at the shul serving us on Shabbat?
So nannies in our house, they are and the caterers in the shul are fully subject to the laws of Employment Canada, or Labor Canada. I don't know what the agency is, but we pay them an hourly wage, or it could be a salary, but they're compensated fairly, and most importantly, they can quit on us anytime, right?
No, but my point is if we're not allowed to have people working for us on Shabbat.
Okay, but so the difference, first of all, the question is, what are they doing for us on Shabbat? So Michelle on Shabbat in our kitchen, right? Michelle does not do any cooking in our kitchen on Shabbat. Michelle, the cholent is in a crock pot, right? That's been cooking from before Shabbat. So she's not doing any malacha. She's not doing anything that a Jew can't do. There are a few things that she does which I will admit that when she leaves or maintenance or somebody leaves at night, they set the alarm code, and then they disarm the alarm in the morning. Now there is an exception for something which is called tzarchei rabim, for the needs of the many. So especially in this climate, when people are shooting at shuls and firebombing shuls and things like that, you definitely want your alarm armed, right? We wouldn't know if somebody snuck into the building and left something in here, right? God forbid. That's a safety protocol. So we have to stay on top of the safety protocol. So they're allowed to do those things because those are considered a great public need. If we're too hot or too cold in the synagogue, those are things that can bring about health concerns. So they're allowed to do that. So that perhaps, but just to be a little bit, to split hairs, and this is maybe an important hair splitting, is that we don't own Michelle, chas v'shalom, right? That's not how. So the work that she does is volitional. And so let's just say the security guard, let's just say he's got a cell phone, right? And he may even take a picture of somebody's license when they come in. I didn't ask him to take a picture of that, but that he does of his own will. So that's fine. Michelle and Jen don't walk to the synagogue on Shabbat morning; they drive, right? But that's on their terms because she's not part of my household by virtue of some ownership, right? Whereas um, your horse, your animal, your etc. Those there's a whole set of rules for animals because you own them; they can't do work. Um, so I hope that, I mean, I think there are two distinctions here. One is the nature of the work that they do, and the second one is they are not officially owned by us. But if someone were to own a slave, then then at least let's say let's use in the biblical scenario, when once upon a time people did own slaves. So I presume that means that you can't say to your slave, okay, take a day off now, and he can go and and light a bonfire in some other place for his own desire. He now is subject to the laws of Shabbat, just as you are.
But you just said if you have somebody fixing your fence, you can't tell them to do it on Shabbat.
No, here I'm going a step further. If he's your if someone is your slave, right? If you're your non-Jewish slave, so yes, he can't fix your fence on Shabbat, but not only that, he can't fry his burger on Shabbat, his own burger.
So you're not talking about a contractor. You're talking about somebody who
Yes, because this is
you
you're right. This
own.
is avdo, right? That is what
Okay.
that's the distinction. Now, I am presenting the full complexity of this issue, and just to be very clear, uh, so this is a book by Yoel Binun, where he calls these a iyun rav tchumi b'Torah. It's a multidisciplinary investigation, and it includes also comparison to other biblical codes or contemporary codes to the Bible. So specifically the Code of Hammurabi, which sort of gives you a sense of what this is about. But he also is trying to look at this phenomenon. And one of the scenarios where you see this is something that I think most of us would have missed entirely. But this is the war of Midian. This is a war of Moshe against the Midianites. And it says, "Vayihi malkoch yeter habaz," and the spoils and the abundance of booty, asher bazazu amatzava, that the men of the army took. So you have tzon, sheshmot elef. So there was 600,000 sheep. V'shivim elef, and 670,000 sheep. V'chameshet alafim, and 5,000. Uvakar shnaim v'shivim elef, right? And cattle was 72,000. Chamorim achad v'shishim elef, and the donkeys were 61,000. And then comes the next verse. It says, "V'nefesh adam min nashim asher lo yadu mishkav zachar," and a total of 32,000 human beings, namely the females who had not had carnal relations. So 32,000 women from Midian are taken. Now, it never says exactly what happens to them. One assumption could be that they all became Canaanite slaves, shivchot Kanaaniyot. What Yoel Binun thinks, though, is that this is too large a number. And in the ancient world, there were two different kinds of slavery. One was individual slavery, that individual people owned individual slaves. That's kind of like the American South. That's how slaves worked in that context. Regrettably, it was a horrible institution. But there was also state or temple slaves. That's what the Jews were in Egypt, right? So that's this number would be a number that you would expect to become sort of a state slave, but you don't hear anything about this out thereafter. And so Yoel Binun's assumption is that these individuals simply get assimilated and absorbed into the Jewish population. Ultimately, I guess he's assuming they converted, but they may have converted through some doorway, from which we will see that slavery was a doorway to Judaism, because the Eved Kanaani, the Canaanite slave, has to be circumcised, and he is then obligated in all of the mitzvot, at least all of the non-time generated mitzvot, would be the obligations of such a slave. And so it seems a little bit different than the way you would understand a slavery, I think, in the modern context. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. The Eved Kanani also had some very strict rules. So one of the rules is the Eved Kanani is Yotzeh b'shein va'ayin, that if you abuse your slave, the slave can go free. So the Psukim says v'chiyakeh ish et ein avdo o et ein amato. If you strike the eye or the of your manservant or maidservant, v'shichta, and it is corrupted, it is damaged beyond repair, l'chavshi yishachenu tachat eino. You must send them free. V'im shein avdo o shein amato yapil l'chavshi. If you knock out a tooth, yapil l'chavshi yishachenu tachat shino. You shall
Is this if
certainly.
it has to get to a court though? It has to get to a Beit Din? I mean, how you can't keep it secret. I mean,
How the civil procedure on these things is not always detailed, right? I mean, I don't know exactly how that was applied in terms of, who's the state regulator for Canaanite slaves, right? I don't know whether the slave would have to take you to Beit Din. It's a reasonable question, Sam, which is who polices that law, right? Who regulates that law? But
I
let's
mean, it
just
would be pretty easy to abuse it. Is all I'm suggesting.
uh, uh,
Possibly. I mean,
certainly, and you know, uh, there are many examples that we have later on in the Tanakh of the abuse not only of slaves but specifically Jewish slaves. But let's just, for the moment, understand that the Torah is creating a law here that allows a slave to go free under these circumstances. Some of the other things that are important to know is that you are not, if a slave escapes from, let's say, the Edomites, and he comes to the Jewish camp, you're not allowed to send him back. You're not allowed to send him back to his former masters. So the fugitive, for example, the fugitive slave law that was such a I want to say it was sort of the bone that the northern states threw to the southern states, while they were trying to preserve the union while abusing human rights, would not be tolerated under Jewish law. And one of the other interesting things is the Avot gave many gifts but never slaves, and many of the kings actually gave them gifts as slaves. So. And what's interesting is both of these verses, which reflect times when they did get slaves. It says that Abraham was made whole. He benefited because of what happened to Sarah, the abuse that happened to Sarah by Pharaoh. So they gave him sheep and cattle and donkeys and male servants and maid servants and mules and camels. And then it says, Vayikach Abimelech tzon v'akar v'avadim u'shvachot v'yitan Abraham. So Abimelech, a lesser king, but one who also abused Sarah, also gave him manservants and maidservants as a recompense. And so Yobi Nun looks at that and he says that sort of shows a sort of a different disposition of the Avot, that they really are, they're not of the slave culture. The slave culture sort of comes from the seats of power. Now, Yobi Nun's ultimate thesis about the whole picture is that he says that the Torah is sort of advancing a quiet revolution against slavery. That is the Torah's agenda here. That is, it's reasonably clear. Now, I should maybe show you one other thing which I think is important. No, I don't think that. There we go. Okay. So this is the beginning of the parsha. So it says, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land, you should observe the Sabbath of God, and it's going to go and talk about 7 years, the sabbatical cycle. And then it's going to come back and it's going to talk about the 50th year, right? It says, V'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall ukiratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh, and you shall proclaim a release. Here, in the traditional one, you should proclaim liberty throughout the land. This is what's on the Liberty Bell. For those of you who are, like Americana. Kratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh. You shall proclaim liberty out the land through all its inhabitants. This idea of the release of all slaves in the 50th year is very much tied into the fact that everybody goes back. It's an economic reset, and it's understanding that slavery exists only as sort of as a safety net of the economic system, and so you have to have this this ability. This word "deror" is a very unique word. It's not one which exists. L'chavshi means to be free, right? But the dror is a different word, and it appears just in a couple of places. And the idea of dror is mass liberty. It is a mass liberty event. And I don't have time to tell you about how it appears in the book of Yirmiyahu, but it's meant to be one of those times where not individual masters release their slaves or sell their slaves or redeem them. It is about a mass liberty event. And so the Torah, on the one hand, seems to be very interested in the freedom of slaves. And I should just, I want to just show you one other verse that speaks to the fact that the Torah is very passionately unhappy about the idea of slavery. Kili b'nei Yisrael avadaihem. To me, meaning to God, are the children of Israel slaves. Sheroteiti od meretz Mitzrayim, all right, which I took out of the land of Egypt. Ani Hashem Elokeichem. Meaning, they should not be slaves to you. They should be slaves to me. The idea of full servitude is a service to Hashem, not a service to other human beings, right? And so the Torah does have this reticence to slavery on the one hand. So Yobi Nun's synthesis of this is, look, slavery could not be eliminated from the structure of life. There were two different major categories of slaves. One were Hebrew slaves, and the other was non-Jewish slaves. Non-Jewish slaves were only acquired in expeditionary wars, of which there were very few. And there were a very small number of instances when that would come about. And so this was barely tolerated with very heavy restrictions on it. But it was clear that this is not something that the Torah wanted to see as a long-term project. And then you have a different kind of slavery, bordering closer to a certain kind of being indentured, which is a safety net for Jewish people. And maybe there's a little bit more to say. What's interesting is about the two different models. One is more of a punitive model, which reduces a Jew's status to a certain extent. That's when you're in the theft case, because in the theft case, as we saw earlier, the thief could take a non-Jewish wife as a way of and he needed ear piercing to be returned, and he gets a special sort of a severance at the end of that. It speaks to a sort of a diminished status. But then there was another version of it, which was really a very, very mild form of slavery, which was a kind of economic indenture for people who had not a stitch of clothing to them. But even so, there seems to be, the Torah has a great reticence to that, and it is also going to have various times where it's going to fully reset this picture, because it doesn't want people to go into this kind of slavery.
And also, was it the person who is to be indentured, he or she is the one that made that decision? It wasn't the others that said, by the way, you owe money and this is what you're going to have to do.
Correct. It's voluntary to a point, but it's only look, I would say that you wouldn't want people to have to be in that situation, right? If somebody really gets to that situation, that means the community is doing something wrong. There maybe at another time maybe when we get to Parshat Rei or something, we'll deal with the way in which Yirmiyahu deals with this, because it's an important addendum to this whole conversation. But next week, by the way, this hour block for both subjects is going to be Rabbi Schachter doing Kabbalah and Sfirat HaOmer.